Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Population Data Science webinar series. My name is Anne Greenwood, and I'm the Education and Train Lead for Population Data BC. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Robin Rowe, who will be presenting on planting the seeds of Indigenous population health data linkage. By way of introduction, Robin Rowe is a staff scientist at ICS Central and the Indigenous Data Team Lead for Health Data Research Network Canada. Robin is a PhD candidate in the School of Rural and Northern Health at Laurentian University with a Master's in Indigenous Relations and Honours BA in Psychology, also from Laurentian University. Robin's role at ICES and with HDRN aims to advance Indigenous-led initiatives around the appropriate governance of Indigenous health data. Robin's work prioritizes relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in order to address governance and sovereignty initiatives that matter to Indigenous nations. So welcome, Robin. We're very delighted to have you today. And just before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience that you have a GoToWebinar panel to the right of your screen. So at any time during the presentation, please feel free to enter comments or questions. I'll queue them up for the end of the presentation, and we'll open the floor to questions. So thanks again, and I'll pass it over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much. And it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having invited me. I am a PhD candidate. As you mentioned, I'm actually defending my dissertation next Friday, which is pretty exciting. So this is like a fantastic warm-up for me.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. This is actually a piece of my full dissertation. It's one of my chapters. So it actually is a really nice warm up to help me get started on that. So I'm just going to say hello, ani bojo kwekwe to everybody. Robin Rowe Indijnikas, Tamiogaman and Donjaba Wabi Makwan and Dodem. So I am a member of Matachewan First Nation, but my family is actually from Tamagami First Nation, which is along the Tamagami area. They live on Bear Island. And so I am coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Robinson, the Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg, and the Wahnapitae First Nation, which is actually in Robinson Treaty Territory. And so I am very happy to be here. And I hope that you enjoy this presentation. It's based on a paper that myself and a couple of colleagues co-authored over the course of a couple of years. And so I feel it's very important that I kind of begin by saying miigwech to my co-authors, Stephanie Shiloh, Desi, and Jennifer Walker, who couldn't be here. And so the whole of this, as I'll explain a little bit more, we gathered, there was a larger group of us who gathered in Banff on the traditional land and waters of the Three Nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so that's in Alberta. And so I really want to thank those nations for the time that they spent with us and the just being able to be there. It was absolutely incredible. And so beyond that, we also had some sponsors, and Laurentian University actually sponsored me to be able to publish this piece. So I want to thank Laurentian University. The Winnebago Area Health Authorities sponsored the actual event. We also had a graphic facilitator who drew the event, is what I like to say. They drew the days. It was fantastic. And Elder Mike Brucehead, who told me that so long as I share what he shared and the events of the couple of days that we were together with at least 50 people, and if all of us shared with 50 people, then that was all the payment he needed. And so this is I feel like I'm much further than 50 people at this point, but this is a piece of that. So as I mentioned, there was a group of us in 2018. We gathered at a conference, the International Population Data Linkage Conference. And this is actually a photo of those who were interested in being in the picture. There's this gap there. Somebody actually walked out of the picture. They didn't want to be part of it. And over the years, I took the picture. So I thought, I should take a photograph of myself and crop me in there, because then I can actually, there's this gap here. It's got to be filled by something. So imagine me in the middle there. But so we gathered in Banff, and we kind of came from all over the world. We had visitors from across the world, some who couldn't make it from, it was Australia, that we had some folks who couldn't make it to the actual event, but we did have people from New Zealand and across Canada and the United States all joining us at this event. And the objectives of the conference and our gathering within the IBDLN conference, which was in 2018, was to really talk about and center Indigenous-driven Indigenous population health data linkage and research. Really, like, it was, for me in 2018, it was one of my first exposures to this international conversation around how Indigenous population health data is being looked at and considered, and how governance is being driven. And so at that time, we had pre-conference events and a conference panel and keynote address. All of these things were being drawn by the graphic facilitator. There were, I was taking notes the whole time, and just all the documents that were kind of shared with us. And so we took all of those things together, and we spent the next little while doing an analysis of, like, what were the key things that were discussed, and how can we ensure that we can share these messages, which was an outcome that we had suggested when we started this gathering. And so when we put it all together, that's where the seeds emerged as a set of guiding Indigenous population health data linkage principles. So the paper describes these in more detail, and I will also describe them in more detail later in the presentation. But really, the principles are very high level principles, and they're meant to be kind of an initial guide, like a stop checkpoint for yourself to consider things like, if you're going to be linking Indigenous population health data, have you considered components of self-determination, components of Indigenous peoples having the inherent right to exercise sovereignty? Have you considered Indigenous ethics? Have you considered data stewardship and governance in general? And is what you're doing supporting reconciliation? And so this image was actually drawn by my best friend, who, and I say drawn, she beaded this for me. She first drew it, and then she beaded it. So I actually have, she framed it for me, but I have this beaded image of the seeds principles that she beaded, which is really, really neat. It's like, if you've ever seen cabs, they're called capuchons, little pieces of an earring. This thing is actually about 5 inches. And so it's a very large earring. I could probably turn it into a very nice medallion, but it was just really nice to have this image be what would then be describing these seeds principles. Ironically, we thought of it later, it was beaded using what are called seed beads. So just a little tidbit of knowledge there. So as we know, Indigenous data and its applications, including things like transfer and linkage, they have the potential to either hamper or empower Indigenous nations. And really what it does is unsettles colonial, governmental, institutional, political, and legal systems that are historically designed to undermine Indigenous self-determination. And that's just it. These systems are historically designed to undermine Indigenous self-determination. And this is pretty unanimous across the world. And there is a historical lack of Indigenous data infrastructure and support, a historical data misuse, non-Indigenous control over Indigenous data that is not representative of Indigenous priorities. And often there's a reliance on non-Indigenous data spaces, and it creates a narrative that's driven by disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference, which are what Maggie Walter coined the 5 Ds of Indigenous data being used by non-Indigenous spaces. So too often, Indigenous data are created or derived and then linked with little focus or understanding of Indigenous histories, priorities, or worldviews. That's kind of the reason for our gathering, is that we were thinking of these things. So then it's like, okay, well, what is Indigenous data? And so some of this presentation is very designed for somebody who maybe is coming to it and hasn't read the paper or hasn't really given too much thought to what Indigenous data are. So they include any information in any format that affects Indigenous lives at the individual or collective levels. That said, sometimes when you think of Indigenous data, you're thinking of data in a very specific way. That's just, mainstream researchers and research spaces don't often think about data as the same sorts of things that Indigenous nations might. So we include things like primary, secondary data, but it also includes historical, oral, traditional information on Indigenous systems, our lands, our resources, environments, peoples, nations. For example, information about our health services, education outcomes, the locations of trails and historic areas, spiritual sites, harvesting areas, traditional place names, membership lists, community stories, all of those things come together and form Indigenous data. And when we think about looking at a set of numerical data from a health system that hasn't been incorporating Indigenous processes or priorities from the get-go, then you're going to actually be missing a lot of these kinds of data pieces that could create or provide a really a deeper image and perspective of what your results would be. So you're disseminating results based on a data set that doesn't include these really valuable pieces of information like that a nation might find actually answers your question or contributes to the way results are disseminated. And so because of a historical lack of these types of considerations, there's this global movement towards Indigenous data sovereignty. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, application, and ownership of Indigenous data and information. And the Indigenous data governance are the mechanisms by which Indigenous data sovereignty is activated. So when we think of things like the OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and possession, which are First Nations principles, or we think of globally, I'll speak about it a little bit later, but there's another set of principles called the CARE principles, which are, again, global Indigenous data governance principles. They're guides. So the SEEDS principles kind of acts as a governance system that helps to guide how research is put forward in order to ensure that Indigenous peoples are actively asserting sovereignty and autonomy over their own information. So data linkage is a process that matches common elements across data files in order to combine information for a single individual. These mechanisms can be very beneficial to the monitoring, measuring, and evaluation of health systems and their outcomes. For example, health data linkage can expose service provision successes and challenges based on patient pathways that, if done effectively, could lead to improved health policies, practices, and outcomes. However, universal approaches to data linkage are often not oriented to benefit culturally and linguistically diverse peoples and are structured to respond mostly to research, government, or system level priorities. So population health data linkage, just in general, is really this process of taking data and linking it to other systems in order to create a maybe fuller or more descriptive story of what the health data are saying. So Indigenous health data linkage is uninformed Indigenous population health data linkage is a violation of Indigenous people's inherent rights. Imposed colonial systems do not always consider Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. Indigenous peoples' inherent rights are affirmed through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UNDRIP, which outlines a set of minimum standards aimed at protecting Indigenous peoples around the world. So globally, there's Indigenous data governance movements, and they're rooted in the UNDRIP. So they're really, Indigenous nations are leaning on the UNDRIP to propel the inherent rights that ultimately can lead to improved governance over data and improved Indigenous data sovereignty. So advancing Indigenous data sovereignty initiatives and priorities, reaffirming Indigenous peoples' ethical rights to free, prior, and informed consent as active participants in consultation processes that affect Indigenous lives. And these things include data and linkage. And just for kind of your own knowledge, specifically in the UN, which lays out these 46 articles, are the right to self-determination, the right to autonomy and self-government, the right to maintain and strengthen distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, the right to dignity and diversity, the right to participate in decision-making, the fact that states shall obtain free, prior, and informed consent, the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies, the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop intellectual property, and the right to determine our own identity or membership. And so, as the most inclusive international instrument that reaffirms the rights of Indigenous peoples, these are really representing the core values that are important to Indigenous peoples from a global perspective. While not perfect, it does have very, very clear, positive, forward-thinking intentions. And so as a result of this document, not as a result of, but by leaning on this document, these international folks just across the globe have really been coming together. So I mentioned the CARE principles. And so actually this was happening at kind of like in the same month we were meeting for the SEEDS conference, the IPDLN conference where the seeds ended up being developed. And at the same time, a couple weeks later, we traveled, myself and Dr. Jennifer Walker, my colleague on the bench in this picture, we actually traveled to Gaborone, Botswana. And so we were in Botswana. I again took this picture and I'm not in it, but and it looks staged. They all thought it was staged, but they knew it wasn't. But we were sitting around again, and we're at this new conference now, and here we are talking about at the time it was the FAIR principles that were being established for scientific data management and stewardship. And so these have been out for several years now. These are mainstream principles, and it's about data being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's for digital assets. And really the principles emphasize machine actionability. So when we were listening to these presentations at the conference around FAIR, a group of us from, again, all around the world, some of the folks in these pictures were involved with the other, like the IPDLN conference, and some were new from new regions. This was a lot more diverse because of where we were meeting and the type of conference. It was just a larger conference. And so we started to talk about, okay, well, what's going on in your countries? And so, we're sitting there, we're talking about OCAP that's happening here in Canada. And, they're bringing up the different kinds of governance principles that are happening in the different regions. And we started to brainstorm, okay, how can we turn this into something that can be actionable? And so that is where the CARE principles were born. And so the CARE principles speak to collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So it's meant as a Indigenous-oriented addition to the FAIR principles. So if you're going to be doing all the FAIR principle components, then you also want to be inclusive of CARE. And so it really started to take shape. And so at the same time, we have this specific to Indigenous population health data linkage happening in another spectrum where we're having those discussions. So we have this global governance and then very specific to IPH data. And so, really clearly there was a point where the CARE principles just kind of, they got further faster than the SEEDS principles. So we really needed to make sure that everyone was kind of clear on the line and the division there. And so when it comes to the SEEDS principles, they didn't have as much international uptake because there just wasn't as much international folks who were part of the conversation as were the CARE principles. And the SEEDS principles are pretty specific to the people who were involved in the ongoing development, which was New Zealand, not Australia. Folks from Australia were involved with the initial work being done to attend the conference, but then they actually didn't attend the conference. But the US and Canada were involved. So these specifically came out of a need to address Indigenous population health data linkage. So when you take SEEDS and CARE together in these spaces, you're really actually hitting all of the different governance. There's so many of the different governance protocols, some of which overlap and some of which don't, that you can make sure that you're actually having good governance throughout the entire data life cycle, including the linkage process. So SEEDS should really be included as supplementary guidelines for use specifically within environments where IPH data are being linked. And again, this distinction is a necessary part of ensuring that the many elements that reinforce and promote Indigenous peoples' data sovereignty are actively cultivated by users of Indigenous data. And so what are these SEEDS principles? So with historic and ongoing challenges within Indigenous data environments, particularly around Indigenous health data linkage, we have these principles that kind of emerged out of, I should have included some of the actual graphics. They're very, very, very pretty. I'm sure you've seen graphic facilitator designs before, but they were really well done. And the points in them are driven home, in my opinion, so much better than all of these words on slides. But self-determination. So first, we really have to consider, and so, sorry, I should really clarify, there's this conference, everybody's sharing, everybody's talking, everybody's presenting. The panel, we have the picture 2 pictures ago where there were 8 people. Those are people from around the world who were part of the actual panel discussion. And all of these points that everybody is making, some of them overlap and some of them are new, but those points are the points that came together to inform how the SEEDS principles came together. So Indigenous priorities around data linkage highlight the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determination and autonomy. Indigenous nations leadership and organizations must identify Indigenous health priorities. That's a like pretty standard. Indigenous nations leadership and organizations must lead research and decision-making processes within research. And this process works to decolonize and transform data collection methods and data environments. It respects Indigenous people's ways of knowing, being, and doing. And at the same time, it's incorporating things like knowledge and language throughout the entire research process. Indigenous definitions of health and wellness are prioritized. So that's thinking of things like Indigenous social determinants of health that really understand the need for collectivity and recognize the impacts of colonialism. And through processes that decolonize, data space was made within Indigenous health research for Indigenous nations to define what Indigenous data are, how diverse Indigenous nations will be identified within data environments, and ultimately how Indigenous data will be linked to non-Indigenous data sets. And in doing this, by ensuring that you are activating self-determination, you're also going to need to recognize and exercise sovereignty. So this includes non-Indigenous groups respecting Indigenous sovereignty while making the necessary space for Indigenous peoples to lead research and exercise that sovereignty. Indigenous data are sacred and require processes that are respectful of Indigenous-based protocols, engagement, collective and community ownership, and collective and community control over Indigenous information. As such, non-Indigenous data holders can contribute towards Indigenous data sovereignty priorities through capacity building, infrastructure support, and by making this space for discussions that support Indigenous frameworks around data transfer. So applying Indigenous data sovereignty principles throughout all steps of data linkage can lead to more meaningful results. And so that's either like if you're linking, it's, thinking of things like the seeds as a guide. And if it's just data spaces in general, really thinking of care. And if it's First Nations data, really thinking of the First Nations principles of OCAP, really recognizing the spaces that you're in and kind of having a firm grasp on all these different spaces. Again, when, we think of ethics, the ethical considerations need to adhere to Indigenous priorities and really reflect Indigenous diversity. And that's, we are culturally and linguistically diverse peoples, and acknowledging that, this overarching world of Indigenous, the word Indigenous that we use is meant to really be it's this catch-all for all Indigenous peoples. But it's important to recognize that different nations have different priorities, and those priorities include different priorities around ethics. And so really understanding that is very important. When working with Indigenous data and linkage, data users must ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is obtained before a research process begins, respecting the lens of data and research transparency and do no harm. And this informed process should be ongoing. So if you're linking to one data set to do one project because, I'm going to take this and I'm going to link it over here and I'm going to do a diabetes study. I have consent. I've gone through the process. The community asked for it. Well, now I have it linked and I could probably look at some other condition while I'm at it. That's not actually following the ethical and free, prior, and informed consent process that is so necessary to ensure that data is being used respectfully, which is pretty standard. So knowledge that's uncovered through data linkage and research must also be given back. So this is something that needs to be considered in ethics processes. I know some institutions do incorporate like what is the community getting, but the thing is that most communities don't really have a want or a need for a pile of paper that's going to sit in a drawer, unfortunately. And so it's really considering how are you giving back? Is there going to be a feast? Is there going to be a ceremony? Is there going to be if this is a truly, genuinely community-driven, Indigenous-led project, then the process of giving back is typically predefined because nations have their own expectations. If they're approaching a researcher and saying, "Hey, this is something that I need done," then there's going to be, and at the end we'll have a feast for the community, or at the end I'd really like to do X, Y, and Z. And there's so many different ways of doing knowledge translation. And if I had somebody ask me one time what the purpose of knowledge translation is and whether or not communities find it relevant. And if you really think about that and you think about the, if I'm giving information back to the nations and it's coming from data that the nations didn't ask to be collected, and it's based on research that's answering governments and research protocols that actually has no relevance to my community, and I actually live here and I know the truth about why my community is facing X, Y, and Z health crisis, and it actually has nothing to do with the rates of whatever the researcher is collecting, then a piece of literature being returned back to me has very little value for me as a community member, or as a nation in general. And so really giving some thought to who is leading this work and what are the intended outcomes of this work? Who is it benefiting is such a valuable and important part of the ethics process. And as is data stewardship and governance, which is something, we hear it in the First Nations principles of OCAP. If you're familiar, the idea of where is that data and who is going to hold it, it's shifting slightly in the OCAP in terms of sensor ownership, control, access, and possession. Possession is shifting a little bit to be, sorry, I just need a drink. it's shifting a little bit to be more around the governance being over the data, whether or not it's in my physical space, which is great, but it doesn't quite account for the importance of infrastructure and Indigenous-led capacity and Indigenous increased capacity around data. Sorry, I have a tickle. So what we really need to make sure of is that we have meaningful partnerships that seek to link Indigenous data, and that these partnerships are collaborative in nature, that they respect existing Indigenous data governance principles such as OCAP and CARE and whatever other, there are nations who have been working in this space for long enough that they have their own either like research ethics types boards or other sorts of principles that they just really, for instance, the Inuit have a set of I believe they're called ITK or IK, like they're knowledge specific. I'm First Nations woman, so I'm not very familiar, but they are life principles as what I was taught, is that they're life principles. And so those life principles actually stem down to many components of specific Inuits, the way they live their life. And so thinking of things like that and just recognizing that this isn't the be all end all. This isn't the governance structure. I'm not giving you the governance structure. I'm giving you the guide to remind you need to go figure out what the governance structure is and ensure that you've appropriately included principles that are necessary in the spaces that you're working with, and really highlight who makes decisions around Indigenous data and how data will be held, managed, used, stored, reused, shared, linked, and for how long. And Indigenous data must be governed by Indigenous nations and used to further Indigenous governance. There's a term in the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. They use governance of data and data for governance. So not only should Indigenous peoples have governance over data, but that governance should be used to advance Indigenous governance. So respecting this process could lead to contractual arrangements. Maybe there's privacy impact assessments, data sharing agreements, data transfer agreements. Typically, there's some sort of actual on paper agreement between the researcher and non, so that you are making sure you've laid it all out. These are the things we're going to do. And I would argue that you line out, these are the things we're not going to do. And that be a living document, that be something that gets updated. For instance, we have things like COVID results that, nobody knew this was coming. So if you have existing governance agreements with communities and nations, and on said governance agreement, there's no mention of a global pandemic or a global pandemic that could potentially lead to nations or peoples within nations who are self-identifying as Indigenous. Well, it's not on the governance agreement that you're not going to actively use COVID-related data that has to do with Indigenous peoples who are self-identifying as Indigenous. If you didn't write it there, it doesn't mean you can just use it. You still have to think about, okay, do we have the appropriate governance? And if somebody identifies as Indigenous and not specifically First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, well, if you have a governance agreement with First Nations and they only expect governance over self-identified First Nations data, then you really need to think about, well, what would be the appropriate way of ensuring governance over self-identified Indigenous specific data? And that might require a little legwork, and I say a little, I mean a lot, to ensure that the appropriate peoples, parties to these information are contacted and have given that, again, free, prior, informed consent before data is then shared widely with the heading of Indigenous peoples have X, Y, and Z results based on Indigenous self-identified data, those sorts of things. So ensuring that your governance agreements are clear and living documents that will account for the unexpected. Especially when you're working in communities who maybe aren't as familiar with the data space, right? It's not a good practice to include or not include things just to try to get around it if it ever came up later, right? So we really need to be honest, and that's an important component of working with Indigenous peoples is acknowledging your honesty and making sure that you are moving forward in a way that is respectful of that honest relationship. And so these kinds of parameters would also need to highlight Indigenous community expectations for the use of the data, who makes decisions about the data, who would have access and jurisdiction over the data, and other predetermined conditions around the data, including publication and authorship processes that are reflective of and led by Indigenous peoples and priorities. And finally, support reconciliation. So throughout all research processes, it's imperative that researchers and data holders recognize and support reconciliation. You know, I'm sure everybody has been hearing pieces of the tragedies happening around the country, and the babies, the children as young as 3 who are being found in unmarked, I don't even want to say graves, because is it a grave if it's unmarked in such a way? I'm not sure. But, you know, finding these young babies, and now we have National Truth and Reconciliation Day happening on September 30th. And like, I'm just thinking of, this is now a federal statutory holiday to recognize, and if I've gone and read the government website, and it said something along the lines of, you know, the people who work for the federal government and extended government get the day off, which is gross and ironic in a really awful way. But to reflect on truth and reconciliation, and like the TRC itself called for this day, but I don't think that they had intentions for this day to be used for a paid day for government officials to reflect on the day, instead of actually going to work and wearing orange and actually actively moving towards reconciliation. So in all the work we do, we have to think of those things. We have to think about, okay, how is this actively supporting reconciliation? Because I would argue that September 30th, while it's going to be a really like sad day for so many of us, it's a day off for government, and that's really does that support reconciliation? I mean, you'll have to make your own decision there, but when you're doing research, the process needs to ensure that researchers know and understand that history and the impacts on Indigenous lives, to acknowledge that those kinds of things, they're still happening. You know, we have this day now, and they're still happening. And so making sure that as we kind of move forward and you're putting outputs out there in the world, that you're considering all these little things. How can what I'm doing have a negative result? And really, the goal is to make space in mainstream data environments to give Indigenous peoples the space needed in order to build capacity and develop infrastructure and create spaces and opportunities for true nation rebuilding. And so in everything you're doing, supporting reconciliation is kind of a cornerstone. So Indigenous peoples around the world have inherent collective rights, and in order to provide research outcomes that are relevant to Indigenous populations, there is an important role for mainstream and settler organizations within this space. And it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights to self-determination, sovereignty, and self-governance. These rights are not granted, they are not earned, they simply exist. And as Indigenous peoples continue to assert our inherent rights, the primary goals are nation rebuilding through self-determination and self-government. Non-Indigenous organizations can contribute by working with Indigenous nations towards accomplishing those goals, by helping to eliminate obstacles and barriers, and advocating for changes to oppressive systemic policies and practices. Globally, initiatives are advancing their collective rights by instilling Indigenous-based protocols for how Indigenous data are defined, owned, accessed, and controlled. This is happening. So I truly believe that we are in the middle of great change. And so as we prepare ourselves for the future, considering, whether or not you're hesitant in the moment and, it's too much work or you don't want to do it, or, our system and our policies are already designed. It's really time to stop and reflect and redesign those systems, because whether you do it now or you do it in a year from now or 2 years from now or 10 years from now, it's coming, it's happening. And so I find it really, interesting to see systems that are sometimes very primed. Some across the country, we have some places that are primed to create governance structures that are inherently rooted in the nations. And they look across the country and they say, oh, but over there, that organization over there is doing it already. And meanwhile, these other spaces have a clean slate to work with. There's no policies to dismantle. There's nothing standing in the way of building governance from the ground up, but they look to other spaces and they see movement and momentum. So they think they're much further behind, but it's actually going to be a lot harder if we keep putting in place structures and systems and policies that are still grounded in colonial thinking. So we have to decolonize our minds in order to create systems that are actually, available and ready to advance for Indigenous peoples. So all that to say, the SEEDS principles emerge from and affirm the UNDRIP. They braid together these international Indigenous perspectives and can guide respectful research approaches for linking Indigenous population health data. Each of the 5 elements of SEEDS interweave and need to be enacted together to create a positive Indigenous data environment. And these two, the idea of SEEDS is that they are living as well. So the fact that this is how they're designed today and this is how I'm describing them to you today doesn't mean that, another paper will come out in a couple of years that will say, actually, we rethought this and now we're changing it to here, or we're adding this, or, all these different things can change because the world is changing, and how we approach data and population health data linkage within the world is also changing. And we just need to recognize it. So recognized as a living and expanding set of principles. So all that to say, miigwech, everybody.
Thanks very much, Robin, for an excellent presentation and very informative for everyone, I know. I'm wondering about your SEEDS principles, if they will be sort of formally intertwined with the other documents that you mentioned, and will there be some place people could go to have all of the information in one place? Do you see that happening? Or
so the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, if you're not familiar, it's GIDA, and I think you can visit the website at gida-global.org. They have been collecting a couple of the larger policies, and they're shareable there. So the CARE principles are shareable there. It was actually GIDA who, GIDA actually formed right after the CARE principles, but in essence, it was all the same people. So we kind of formed it all at the same time. But the different countries who have different things going on, papers and whatnot, you can find some of them there. SEEDS, I don't know if it's up there or if it will be at some point, but Stephanie Carroll is one of the co-authors and also the lead for GIDA. So I imagine if it's not there, it will be eventually.
Great. That's good to know that people, because as you've mentioned, it's a living document. So it would be nice for people to know kind of where to go. They could find the most up-to-date information in one place, if that's maybe the plan going forward, do you think?
I think that the document itself is probably pretty firmed up, but any future writings on it would maybe be slightly different or have a different flair, a different take. Most of the things that the paper itself is likely not going to change, but there might be a new paper in another year that will come out and have some additions and maybe a closer integration or weaving between it and the care principles, and how you can actually implement both, and maybe something a little bit more descriptive on, each of the components of the different elements of seeds, and how do you actually do it, as opposed to just these high level kind of theoretical discussions we tend to have.
Right. Yeah. I think that would be very valuable, as you say, to have some practical pieces for people to understand and see in action, for sure. I'm just wondering, with your position at ICES, if you're working with others to do some related initiatives. Do you see that developing in the near future, that people could learn more about it?
Yeah, it's definitely on my many things list of things to do. My first thing to get off is just finish the degree, and then I'll be able to actually focus on some of these external things. But I do have plans of trying to figure out how to not just create a practical piece, but globally, there's all these different conversations happening around. We talk about Indigenous rights, Indigenous priorities, and things like that around data. And there's actually a larger global conversation happening around, okay, but what are those? And I think that kind of thing melded into, okay, now that we actually have affirmed documents or like a globally agreed upon list of some of the potential rights and real interests for Indigenous peoples, now how do we activate something like care or seeds within those spaces? Because the care principles, for instance, they've been around since, I want to say 2019, they were released officially. And those principles are still in the stages. I think everything was hampered by COVID, but the stages of deciding what that would look like. So how do we activate care is still not 100% happening. I have seen it happening in some spaces, though, specifically data repositories. The care principles are laid out slightly differently. So they've actually done like collective benefits, and then underneath it, it'll be like C1, C2, C3, and it'll have a list of different components. And so I've seen some of the repository spaces actually using that as a guide to be able to like, are we doing this? Are we doing that? And that kind of thing moving forward might be really beneficial to something like the seeds document. Have you done this? Have you done that?
Right. Yeah. And so within people's work, they can, as you say, actually document and say, footnoted, here it is, right? This is how we've done that.
Yeah.
We've met these goals. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for your contact email here. So if people have questions, they can ask you directly. And maybe when we put up the recorded session, I could also put a link to maybe the sources you think would be most beneficial for people to look on. You've got obviously the lovely list of references for your work, but maybe also the key ones that they should look for as well.
Yeah, that would be. I could probably pull something up right now. I have another presentation I'm doing tomorrow, and I didn't include that on this presentation, but I have a slide that might be something people might find interesting. So these specific documents, these are all open access,
right?
And so the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Towards an Agenda, you can find these in PDF form. So this is the state of open data, good data, and Indigenous data sovereignty and policy. So these these are full 300-page books.
Wow.
And each chapter is written by different people around the world. State of Open Data, I believe, has a specific First Nations Information Governance Center chapter. I believe there's one in there on Indigenous data sovereignty with some of the global partners. Indigenous data sovereignty and sovereignty and policy, the top and bottom, they each have a chapter written by different countries, people in different countries. So there's actually chapter 6 of Indigenous data sovereignty and policy it was written by myself, Jen Walker, and Dr. Julie Bull. who is a Inuit researcher as well, or I'm not sure if she's still a researcher, but she's definitely an advocate for Indigenous ethics. And so there's conversations in these books as well if you're interested in additional resources.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for highlighting those. I think those are excellent resources and places people could go immediately and get further information that you've discussed. So thank you for sharing those. Thanks again for presenting, Robin, and we look forward to hearing more from your work in the future.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and thanks everyone for attending, and bye for now.